way to our seats so we can start the next session. Thank you very much. House rules, Andre explained at the last session, so I will not go over them again. To start the session, we will have Timothy Caper talking about how dehorning reduces rhino poaching results presentation.
Good morning. First of all, apologies to those who have heard this talk before. Our conservation community is small, and I've been talking on this topic a number of times. I just wanted to start by saying thank you to the other speakers. I feel like I've learned so much these last few days. An earlier speaker mentioned how that one afternoon on the river, he learned more than his whole undergraduate. I could say the same about the last few days. Except for Prof. Parker, one of my undergrad lecturers here, I did learn lots from you. I want to talk about impact evaluation. Conservation scientists, conservation researchers, myself included, we're very good at measuring the state of biodiversity, the state of rivers, the state of populations, rates of poaching, kind of describing biodiversity trends and describing the biodiversity crisis and documenting it. We're slightly less good at identifying the drivers of these changes in biodiversity. Not just the direct drivers, but the more distal drivers, such as our diets and so forth. We're even less good at evaluating solutions to these problems. And a part of the reason for that is that it's very difficult to measure success and to attribute changes in biodiversity to particular interventions. And it was very difficult in this project, and it wouldn't have worked if it was just me as a scientist. I was a very small part of the team that was involved in evaluating interventions to reduce rhino poaching in the greater Kruger region. And I'll acknowledge that team in a moment. But first, I just wanted to put a quote up from Nelson Mandela, because I think he understood something long before we as conservation scientists and researchers understood this, was the relationship between human well-being and biodiversity. And you'll see snippets of that through the presentation today. And being from Nelson Mandela University, I'm very proud to be at a university that's named after such an eminent figure as Mandela. And many of you will know he had a passion for conservation and quite innovative ideas about how to achieve effective conservation. So as I said, this is not my project. Some of you will know the lady on the top left, and will know that tragically she died this year. She died 5 days before our article was published in the international journal Science. And Sharon should have been the first author of this paper. I was, just because I did the writing and the stats. But it was her idea, and she was the visionary behind this project. She got together with Stephen Whitfield, one of the regional rangers in Kruger National Park. The two of them were bold enough to admit that strategies to reduce rhino poaching in the greater Kruger region were not working. Lots of money was being plowed into rhino conservation, and she was bold enough to ask, what's going on? What's working? What's not working? And she was visionary in getting together private reserve owners around Kruger National Park and high-level managers and scientists within sandparks into the same room, and then bringing a few of us I'm not a professor, a few of my professors and myself into the room to think about this problem together. And that is what gives me hope in the biodiversity crisis, is the power of people working together and the solutions that we can come up with when we put our minds together and put our skills together and are humble enough to shine the light on ourselves. So just to acknowledge all these people, Marcus Hofmeyer, Joe Shaw, Kathy Dreyer, the head ranger at Kruger. My PhD supervisor at Oxford was Professor E.J. Milner-Gulland. Some of you will know her through her conservation optimism movement. And then Professor Rez Altweg, professor at the Center for Statistics in Ecology and Environment at UCT. So that's kind of my background, and bread and butter is maths and stats, and I've had lots of opportunity to apply these skills to conservation problems. So we were focused on the greater Kruger region, Kruger National Park and the surrounding reserves. And we're really proud about this. I remember the moment we found out that our article was going to be featured on the cover of Science. It was a very exciting moment. But I wasn't quite prepared for the flurry of interviews that I had to do during the press release for that paper. But it was great to speak to people and be able to get the message out there about our research. I've said this already. This project was not conceived in a university. It was conceived on the ground by managers facing a rhino poaching crisis. They then got together a team of data collectors who spent a whole year gathering data on all the interventions that were implemented in these reserves and in Kruger to tackle rhino poaching, the cost of these interventions, and then measures of rhino poaching, measures of incursions onto reserves in order to evaluate the impact of these interventions. So during the study period, over 1,700 rhinos were poached. We actually included additional data, and it was closer to 2,000. Many of you will know the rhino population was around 12,000, I think around 2008, 9, 10 in Kruger, and it's now less than 2,000. So massive declines in rhino populations. This is obviously a very complex system with lots of different reserve types, lots of different governance structures. The size of the reserves vary. So what we're trying to do was very complex. And the socio-political context also muddies the water a bit, because we're measuring the impact of interventions while also acknowledging that many other things influence poaching rates, not just the interventions. So we needed to think of ways of accounting for that. COVID happened right in the middle of this study. So these were the interventions that we analyzed. Some traditional law enforcement interventions like tracking dogs and militarized ranger patrols, and then some more novel, slightly controversial ones, polygraph testing, and then dehorning as well. So this is the context. Poaching rates, population sizes of rhino vary widely, and that's the variation we wanted to leverage to understand the impact of interventions. So we learned very early on, and I've learned this as a statistician, that data and numbers and graphs are not as objective as we like to think they are. And I really believe in combining data with the insights and operational experience of people on the ground, both in terms of helping design the models. I've had rangers in Zimbabwe help me design models of spatial patterns of elephant poaching. In this case, the managers helped us measure success, helped us quantify the interventions, how do we measure them, and so forth. So this was really important to combine these two. Secondly, as a statistician, I've learned that you need to start with hypotheses, very clear hypotheses that are written down as to what you expect to find, and then then only start analyzing data. Otherwise, you go down rabbit holes and draw wrong conclusions. So we were kind of testing the empirical evidence for these hypotheses as to how these different types of interventions reduce poaching. In a nutshell, we looked at variation in poaching and how it relates to the intensity of interventions. Obviously, it's a lot more complicated than that. Interventions overlap. There's non-intervention factors affecting the results. And we used a Bayesian hierarchical model with random effects to try and account for some of that. We measured not only ultimate outcomes, but also intermediate outcomes, like intermediate being the detection or arrest of a poacher, ultimate being less rhinos poached. So over R1 billion was spent, and this is a minimum estimate. We didn't have cost data for all the interventions in all the places in every year. So this is a minimum estimate, and you can see the variation in the amount spent on the different interventions. Obviously, security staff we decided to include as a specific expense item because during this period, rangers and managers, security managers, were largely focused on patrolling to reduce rhino poaching. And I know many rangers and managers look forward to a day, and indeed one of the managers said the way he measures success is when one day he's not having to manage a crisis of rhino poaching and is able to just do conservation. So this graph got me into a lot of trouble with a lot of people, and we actually had to have an emergency meeting to bash our heads and in disagreement as to what these results mean. And Kathy Dreyer, the head ranger at Kruger, those of you who know her, she's a fantastic diplomatic person, and she helped us get there in the end. Basically, the only intervention that we found strong statistical evidence for reducing poaching across these reserves was dehorning. This does not necessarily mean that these other interventions were not working. And indeed, one of our conclusions was dehorning works together with these other interventions. And we didn't have many sites where there was just no dogs or no rangers, so it was, you could argue, an unfair comparison. But in terms of the statistical signal we found, nothing was close to what we found for dehorning. But these other interventions were successful on other counts. So the dogs helped achieve hundreds of arrests. These AI cameras were detecting poachers, and there was follow-ups. This wide area surveillance system was intervening to detect poachers as well, often before, this is a kind of a radar system, before rhinos were poached. But this is really our headline result, that we had multiple replicates of intervention of dehorning at different times, and every time it achieved quite large reductions in poaching. One of our reviewers, a professor at Stanford University, introduced us to this technique, regression discontinuity, to be more certain about causal effects. And anyway, when you put all the reserves on the same scale relative to the timing of dehorning, that effect just becomes even clearer. So what are our conclusions? Dehorning is very effective, but it's not a magic bullet. So in the 2 years after our study ended, over 100 rhinos were poached in Kruger that had been previously dehorned. One of my PhD students working on a reserve in South Africa that does dehorning, and they've lost rhinos the week after the rhino was dehorned. So a bit of horn remains on the animal, and that's still attractive. But overall, poaching rates have declined. And the PhD student I mentioned, her name's Lucy, a fantastic student. She has a poster on dehorning in the back. She's looking at whether dehorning may just shift poaching to other areas. She's got data from, I think, 80 sites. A really impressive data set she's working on. I think this is not an ideal solution. I wouldn't like to think in 20 years we're still having to dehorn rhinos, but I think it buys us time to address the more ultimate drivers of poaching. I'll just jump ahead here. So I think detecting and arresting poachers is obviously part of the solution, but there's massive systemic factors that dampen the effectiveness of this. So I think people are still willing to take quite high risks in this kind of environment where they may get out on bail if they are caught. Corruption offers a way around interventions. consumer demand and socioeconomic inequality creates massive incentives to poach, even if it's quite risky. So in such an environment, reducing rewards is potentially more effective than increasing risks. I'll just quickly say, one of my intellectual heroes, Daniel Kahneman, Nobel Peace Prize in Economics, also spoke about how outcomes that are certain have more of an influence on behavior than those that are merely probable. So like, there's a chance you'll get caught, but the rhino's horn value has definitely declined if according to dehorning. I asked my co-authors for some key messages that they wanted to share, and one of them was to remember that behind all these interventions are people, and their integrity, their motivation, their well-being is critical. One thing we didn't talk about, which was a big limitation of the study, just because there weren't enough projects or examples, was the kind of community involvement, community governance, the communities having a voice in rhino conservation was one of the glaring holes in this study. And this is just to end on the point that I made at the beginning. And yeah, don't know if there's time for questions.
Thanks, Timothy, for that great talk. I'm sure we can take a question or two if anyone has one. Oh, one over there.
Thanks for a really nice talk, Tim. I actually recently got an email asking about what the alternatives are to militarization and conservation around rhinos. And it strikes me that, dehorning is not a militarized approach. But so I guess my question is if you see it like that, or if it is only effective because of this package of things that we're doing.
Yeah, thank you. So it was really hard for us to say whether dehorning would have been as effective in the total absence of these interventions to detect and arrest poachers. The kind of diplomatic conclusion we came to was that it probably is just one tool amongst many, and it shouldn't be seen as a magic bullet. But I do think it does present quite a contrast to militarized approaches. And I do think our study, although it's not a direct result of our data, our study does question a focus solely on detecting and arresting the bad guys. That's the way we're going. And we just need to get smarter and better technology, better cameras. We need to be more intelligent in the way we deploy patrols. I'm not sure that's going to make as big a difference as addressing the bigger drivers like demand, inequality, corruption, and then doing things like reducing the reward from it through dehorning. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Timothy. And as you exit stage left, if I could ask Susan DeWitt to come up. Susan will be talking to us about what evidence exists for the financial performance of wildlife-based land use in Southern and East Africa.
Hi, it's great to be here. Not easy to follow Tim, so bear with me. But thank you so much to the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust and Commonwealth for funding this PhD research that I'm undertaking through Stellenbosch University in association with the African Wildlife Economy Institute and Oxford University. So why the title, Original Biodiversity Finance? Obviously, there's a lot of interest and excitement around carbon credits and biodiversity credits. Thank you, Matt, for that excellent talk about understanding the additional income streams into rangelands from these instruments. But my research is really, or our research is looking into the incredible kind of regional success story of ecosystem restoration at scale. So over 100 million hectares have been converted to wildlife-based land use using predominantly private finance. And as many of you are aware, looking at GBF targets, for example, there are tens of billions of additional private investment dollars that are being targeted to come into conservation and restoration spaces. So what we're trying to do is understand the investment proposition of wildlife ranches, reserves, conservancies, to try and broaden the type of investor that's interested, and perhaps not leave it in the domain of high net worth individuals. So we've started with a systematic evidence review. We're actually collecting empirical data from landholders at the moment, which is where the pictures come from. But as I say, we started out with this review. Our question was around, or we were looking for papers that had empirical data on financial performance of wildlife-based land use, which, if you don't know, includes activities like tourism, hunting, breeding, sales of live animals, meat production, and so on. We were looking for papers across Southern and East Africa from extensive systems on non-state land, so that's private and community land. And we started out with 4,248, and we finally analyzed 75 of those papers, half of which are peer-reviewed. And most excitingly, data was collected from over 6,000 sites across 50 years, so a really robust data set. From this cumulative graph, you can see really South Africa kind of predominates in terms of the numbers of papers, especially over the last 10 years. And Namibia and Botswana, probably about 15 papers each. East Africa, really underrepresented. What this graph doesn't tell you is that there were 3 times more studies on private land than on community land. Spoiler alert, before I get into the results, wildlife enterprise does indeed tend to generate a profit, similarly to other extensive farming systems, and tends to be better than those alternative farming systems. But let's dig a little bit deeper. So we analyzed the data according to this framework. We compared according to institution, and that largely centered around property rights. Then we looked at different business activities, consumptive, non-consumptive, and other livestock. And we looked into also management strategies, particularly ecological decisions that landholders take. We evaluated a subset of 40 of the papers that included papers that had actual financial ratios, and they were adjusted according to inflation and converted to dollar values for 2023. So in terms of institution, really, I suppose country-specific data lends itself to reasonable comparison. You'll see across the top line there, that's distribution of land tenure within those different Southern Africa countries, so that this data set was from Southern Africa. The red is private land, green, community land, and blue is state land. In South Africa and Namibia, private land predominates. And indeed, in Zimbabwe, when most of these studies were done in that country. That second line indicates wildlife user rights. They occur across a spectrum. In all countries, they are devolved in Southern Africa, but they're strongest in South Africa, weakest in Namibia. This line, the bold number is the revenue per hectare in dollars, and the smaller number underneath is the number of sample sites from which that average was taken. So in South Africa, the average is around $77 per hectare. That accords with our hypothesis, and some of those hypotheses were kind of borne out in the papers themselves, that stronger property rights tend to result in higher productivity. So why, you might ask, does Namibia look so much less? Because they have a similar kind of regulatory framework in their country. And obviously, there are confounding factors and complicating factors. So Namibia, for example, is a lot more arid. The carrying capacity is a lot lower. In fact, in our sample, we found that those farms tended to be between 1,000 to 15,000 hectares. In South Africa, closer to 5,000 hectares. And that's not the only reason. There are other regulations. For example, in Namibia, buffalo trade is restricted, and we know that that's quite lucrative in other markets. Moving on to the community data, and firstly I want to say we're not comparing like with like here. For private landholders, that income represents the full amount of tourism hunting income that accrues to the landholder. When it comes to community, there is a percentage that accrues from the operator. So a recent paper, for example, in Namibia shows that communities receive about 25% of operator income, and that translates to about $5 per hectare. You see there highlighted in green. In fact, the papers that we looked at seem to affirm our hypothesis around strength of property rights. In Namibia, they have devolved more strongly than in other contexts. So you might wonder what that 166 is doing there. That's a single site. That's Makuleke next to Kruger National Park. And we're actually in the process of engaging with the researcher around that particular number, which seems quite deviant. So we're just trying to figure out why. When it comes to operator income, again, this is income minus fees that go to government, about 20 to 30%, and fees that go to communities. And as you can see that it's quite similar to community land. The average size of those hunting blocks or GMAs tend to be, or can be up to 1 million hectares. Community land, by contrast, 100 to 350,000 hectares within this particular sample. I want to give you one reference point in carbon markets, and it's going to be a wide range, so bear with me. But REDD+ projects earn between $20 and $150 per hectare, depending on the quality of the credit. So that gives you an indication of where this data set stands. All right, moving on to business activity. So all of the papers mentioned the shift from wildlife to livestock systems. About 30 papers specifically explored that conversion, and there was financial data in 17 of those papers that we were able to compare. This is an aggregate of all the private enterprise data across the region. And as you can see, the average revenue in wildlife is about 3 times that of livestock, and the profit is about 50% higher. And one of the main reasons that's given in these papers is the fact that there's a diversity of income streams within the wildlife system, so you're adding value over and above meat production. What you'll also notice, though, is that there's a huge range or variance in wildlife revenues. And that is quite a deterrence to investors. They don't like volatility because they can't understand what the risk is of their investment. On the right-hand side, you'll notice that the return on investment looks pretty similar, and you might ask, well, why is that, considering the discrepancy between revenue generation? And that's largely because the investment in wildlife to get it going is a lot higher. Again, I want to give you maybe a reference point around returns, particularly on the continent. So African private equity funds are targeting a 20, 30 to 30% IRR, internal rate of return. At the moment, they're achieving less than 5% over a 10-year period. There's another large study that's been done on the loan book of smallholder agriculture farmers in East Africa, and that's returning minus 5%. So we're looking pretty good here. This is probably not news to any of you. Tourism tends to earn the most revenue per hectare, much more expensive to set up. Breeding of high-value species second, although most of this data was taken before the market crash at the end of 2018 in South Africa and Namibia. The wildlife-livestock mix quite often is found to be more resilient than either one or the other, consumptive, non-consumptive. And you might wonder why consumptive use is so low, and really that's limited by the number of trophies available on these properties. So moving on to management strategy, and we also wanted to kind of dive into the papers to understand the relationship between financial and ecological outcomes. And we found that 65 of the 75 papers the researchers of those papers actually collected ecological data, and 56 specifically explored the relationship between financial and ecological data. So I've created quite a simple kind of 2x2 matrix just to show you where the balance of evidence lay. So across the horizontal axis on the right-hand side, synergy indicates where ecological outcomes improve, profits improve as well. A trade-off indicates that where your profits improve, your ecological outcomes deteriorate. The robust evidence would be things like peer-reviewed papers, primary data collection by the researcher, some sort of observational component of the research design, maybe even a comparator. And more moderate evidence, we'd include grey literature in that, maybe secondary data collection and inference from models and so on. So you can see there, in terms of what are positive ecological outcomes, so they would include things like an increase in abundance, obviously within an ecological carrying capacity, a diversity of species, and introduction of indigenous rare species, or the big five. And on the negative side, you saw the effects of overstocking, perhaps introducing extralimitable species, or depredation to protect herds. So in terms of this very simple diagram, the balance of evidence seems to sit in that bottom right-hand corner, where there's moderate evidence that these outcomes are synergistic. And there is a small amount of robust evidence in certain models to show that there is a trade-off. I think this is missing the fact that the kind of biggest ecological indicator of these enterprises is the fact that habitat has converted from single species or monocultures to multi-species rewilded systems, and that's not included in this diagram, and that happens across the board. So, in conclusion, 80% of the enterprises in the 6,000 kind of data set, 6,000 farm data set, were profitable, and that is significant. There is enough cash flow, despite there being no government subsidy into this sector, to be able to support viability. Now, we also found that wildlife outperforms cattle and sheep. And indeed, if you guys were here for Francois' talk this morning, might be a substitute for maize in this region at some point in the coming decades, but really provides an alternative, sustainable alternative to these other extensive farming systems. And finally, although the ROI the return on investment is lower than in other industrial sectors, there is definitely an opportunity for patient investors to come in who might not need to make an outsized profit on the operating model itself, but can be in the market long enough that they can benefit from capital appreciation of the land, which is really wrapped up into the profitability of this model. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan, for a great talk. I'm sure there must be questions, because that's quite an interesting topic. Anybody? Hands in the air. Yes? Gentleman over.
Good afternoon. Finally, some good news. Your dollar per hectare rate, particularly for South Africa, it's 77 for the private sector. Did you break that down across the country? Or is that...
No.
Okay.
No, it isn't broken down against the country.
Can it be done?
Pardon?
Can it be done?
Yes, well, there are certain studies that yes and no. It can be done if we are able to access raw data from some of the big studies. So Andrew Taylor's study, Haley Clemens' study, and so they have collected data from Limpopo, Eastern Cape, and differentiated. But we will be doing that in the empirical part of the data collection, so trying to get reasonable sample sizes from the kind of major centers, which I'd love to chat to you about, actually.
Fantastic,
Declan.
thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much,
Great,
Susan.
thanks.
Please could I call to the front Sibusiso Dlamini, who's going to talk to us about fire frequency and experimental warming changes, soil microbial diversity in alpine grassland, South Africa.
Good morning. My name is Trevor, and I have no jokes. I did a study in the Maloti Drakensberg in KZN, and this is an ecosystem that is very important for carbon sequestration, and it has evolved over the years with fire, and it is currently managed by fire. However, it is affected by global warming. And so this then led us to the aim of investigating the effects of experimental warming and varying fire frequencies on soil microbial communities. And an objective I'm presenting today is the way we assessed the influence of experimental warming and fire frequencies on soil microbial community structure, and focusing on bacteria and fungi abundance and diversity. So the experiment was designed or laid out in 1980, which the fire frequencies, we have 4 fire frequencies where we're burning annually, biannually, quinquennially, and infrequent, which is a control. I do have to mention, of course, that ever since the experiment was set up, the infrequent control has had 3 arson fires, and the latest one was 14 years ago. And then in 2017, open-top chambers were installed in the same fire frequencies to test for the effect of global warming. So these chambers increase the microclimate by plus or minus 2 degrees Celsius. And then in total, I sampled 32 soil samples at a 5 centimeter depth. So with some extensive analysis, we produced some results. And I would like to draw your attention to infrequent fire, which is our control. And what we found for bacteria is that proteobacteria, which is a group of bacteria that requires a lot of carbon and nitrogen and is actually adapted to contribute in recycling unavailable carbon and nitrogen for it to be available. And this is important in this ecosystem because then it allows for the grasses over there to get sufficient and required nitrogen. And for fungi, again, what we found was that 2 dominant groups, which is Ascomycota and Basidiomycota, which feed on a lot of dead material. And this is important in this ecosystem, particularly on the less frequently burnt plots, where you tend to have a lot of dry biomass, and then this group is responsible for decomposing them, which provides a very important ecosystem service. And so further to look into some alpha diversity, and I'd like to draw your attention to Shannon diversity and the infrequent band, which is our control. For bacteria, we found that if you include warming in the ecosystem, we tend to have an increase in our alpha diversity. And with the other fire frequencies, there are some subtle changes, even though they may not be significant, but those changes are driven by both the fire frequencies and experimental warming. And for fungi, again, we found almost a similar trend where if you include experimental warming into the ecosystem, we tend to have a subtle reduction in our alpha diversity, but then changes in fire tend to increase our alpha diversity. And this was coupled with the analysis of multiple soil chemical characteristics. And what we found was between the fire and warming treatments, there are no significant differences. But these properties were used for mostly looking at how do these chemical properties coupled with the experimental warming and the fires shift our microbial community structure. And what we found is, even though there are some changes, but the structure remains the same. But some of the ordination or grouping of the communities is influenced by both fire frequencies, experimental warming, and also some of the chemical properties. And we found the same trend again with our fungal groups as well, where pH, carbon, and nitrogen were very strong drivers of some of these changes. And then now in understanding all of that, we still then had to try and identify in each specific treatment which specific taxa are responsible for the change. And we used microbial bioindicators, which are very good indicators to use because then they tell you about the soil health and how, which ecosystem services these specific bacteria groups are doing. And for bacteria, we found a total of 59 significant taxa. And one groups that stood out are these families which were enriched in infrequent fire and warming plots, and most importantly because they're responsible in nitrogen cycling, particularly changing ammonia to nitrates, which is what plants are able to take up. And for fungi, we found 88 taxa, and those ones are more responsible for organic matter turnover. So these are very important ecosystem services that these microbes are providing to the ecosystem as influenced by these pressures. And so in essence, the changes in fire frequency and experimental warming result in changes in bacteria and fungal diversity and richness, while maintaining a very stable community structure. And despite these pressures, the communities are still resilient in maintaining the ecosystem. And I would like to acknowledge the following individuals and organizations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. You've actually taken away my next expression, which was going to be tempus fugit for being so fast. If anybody's got any questions. We have a question over here. I'll give you my microphone.
Sorry, thanks very much. Just a quick question. You looked at fire frequency. Was there any measure of fire intensity and how that affects microbes?
For my study, no. But I think NRF SAION has plans to factor that in the coming experiments. Yeah.
Any more? That being the case, thank you very much. Appreciate your chat. Thank you. Next up, we have a panel discussion. Hopefully they'll be setting up chairs, etc., etc. But it's the clicks and the environment, journalism's responsibility to deepen climate literacy. And the panel includes Michael Cross, who I know as a documentary maker, who featured me in one of his documentaries, together with Ntokozo Mbuli, Soku Subia, and Leonie Joubert.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear us. First of all, a very warm welcome to this panel for our remote viewers. We're here live at the 14th Oppenheimer Research Conference. I'm your convener, Michael Cross, and we're very lucky to be joined by an esteemed panel of guests who bring a wealth of experience from across the media industry to discuss our topic. And our topic is Clicks and the Climate Crisis, Journalism's Responsibility to Deepen Climate Literacy. We're at a pivotal point in climate reporting, with news outlets not only competing for readers' limited attention, but also facing shrinking budgets. Despite this, there's never been a more important time to cover stories that deepen public understanding of research and conservation, to ensure that the stories that matter are truly getting told. We'll start by hearing specific insights from each of our guests, followed by a more open discussion. And sadly, we won't have time to field questions from the audience, but for those joining online, please post questions in the chat, and our panelists will hopefully have time to respond following the session. And for those here, you can, I'm sure, find our panel outside afterwards. That sounded ominous, but you know what I mean. Before we dive into the questions, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, just a quick 30-second or so intro, so we can all get to know you better. And I'd like to start, if I may, with Ntokozo Mbuli, founder and managing director of Sugar Bean Pictures. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your work.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Ntokozo Mbuli. I've been a conservation journalist, storyteller for a very long time, since 2006, I think, when I first started working on South Africa's flagship nature conservation and environment show, 50/50. I was a presenter on the show, and then later I became executive producer on the show. Now, my journey has taken a little bit of a shift. I'm a National Geographic explorer, and I've used that opportunity to now focus my storytelling on rural communities, indigenous people, African cultures and traditions, and look at the synergies and meeting points between what the indigenous knowledge take is on conservation, sustainability, climate, and the environment, see if that's usable in the current space, and then also disseminating information on climate crisis and conservation to those communities in a manner and a language that would make them want to do something and want to connect with the material, because there's a big gap at the moment due to socioeconomic issues. Bread and butter things are most important at the moment. So I'm finding my way to weave conservation in there. And that's my story in short.
Thank you so much. Next up, Soko Sabia. You're a senior news editor at Africa.com. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Soko Sabia. I'm the senior news editor for Africa.com. Africa.com is a digital news publication, and what we do is we curate the news coming out of the continent to show the progressive nature, people, issues that need to be discussed. And our whole ethos is that the solutions come from within Africa. People are there doing it. These are the people we should highlight. These are the issues. This is how you should tackle it. So we meet people where they are. And our whole mission behind it is to show that Africa is not a risky place. There are people who are there, who are with the communities, who know what's going on, and these are the people you should speak to. So we highlight change makers in any space. It could be human rights, it could be conservation, it could be climate change, it could be science. We've actually now even branched onto AI and who are the role players in AI. My background is also in science communication. I used to work at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research for quite a long time, actually, and my role there was to basically tell the research stories. One of the things I'd ask researchers when I came on is, why should I care about your research? A lot of them were upset, had a lot of fights with lots of researchers because of that question, but it's fundamentally that's the gap that's missing. People don't understand why they should care about the research you're doing. How does it affect me every single day, and how do you then tell the next person to also care about it?
Thank you so much. Next up, Leonie Joubert, you're a science writer and journalist. I've always liked the phrase "at large," and based on your recent travels, I think that term is accurate. Could you maybe also just tell us a little bit about yourself and your work?
So back in, I think it was 1912, the ornithologist Robert Murphy said, he wrote famously that he could now join a higher cult of mortal because he had seen the albatross. And 20 years ago, when I was a rookie writer, I was able to join the same cult of mortal on a trip to the Prince Edward Islands. And that was when my career as a science writer and a storyteller and a specialist climate reporter started. 20 years later, I've joined another unusual group of mortal in that I've seen a wild pangolin take a poo in the southern Kalahari. And at the risk of being indiscreet, one of the pangolins we've seen photographed up here was the very personality. That was part of an assignment for National Geographic magazine a few years ago. And in between, I've written multiple books. I used to say that I write about climate change and food security, but actually I write about pollution, carbon pollution of the atmosphere, how food-like products pollute our bodies with the so-called self-inflicted injuries of obesity, etc. But the main reason I mention this trajectory is the reason that we are here today as panelists. I was at the top of my game, writing for National Geographic, and then suddenly, globally, journalism hits an existential crisis and funding collapses. Newsrooms have slashed staff. I go from being able to thrive as a specialist science writer to having to sell my home. And I figured the best way to keep doing the only thing that I know how to do, because I can't darn socks or mend pipes, is to put what I have into a little plumber's van and hit the road. And I have been on the road for a year, traveling around the country, doing deep investigative reporting on why the Namaqualand area is turning to a dust bowl, why farmers in the Drakensberg are overstocking their land and driving overgrazing, why the home of someone living in an informal settlement in Durban is 50 degrees during a heat wave, when outside it's a tolerable 35. These are all the stories that I'm telling, and I'm so excited to be here because I'm about to launch into a deep dive into bush encroachment. So that's it. Story Arc, Tales from Southern Africa's Climate Tipping Points, is a desperate attempt to get climate stories into the public discourse at a time where the science tells us what we achieve in the next few years will determine the outcome of life for many, many thousands to come.
Thank you so much. I was joking earlier, this is a panel made up of a threatened species in the form of journalists, and I think we might be verging on endangered. But Leonie, I'd like to just ask you, based on what you said in terms of this newsroom collapse and the need for environmental reporting growing more urgent than ever, is your Story Arc project perhaps testing a new model for climate reporting? And could you maybe just talk about the need to be different and to find new ways to do things?
So my entire career as a science writer is the result of progressive, smart-thinking academics in the scientific community putting money aside to support a journalist to become a specialist. So my master's in science journalism, which took me to the Prince Edward Islands, is thanks to a collaboration with Stellenbosch University. And this particular project is also partly funded by the School for Climate Studies at Stellenbosch. There's absolutely no ways that I could do this as a self-funded project, and there's no ways that I could pay for it with freelance writing. So I have a small income from Stellenbosch University over a short period of time, and I have funding from the Henry Tumalu Foundation, which supports investigative journalism. And that just allows me to pay the bills. You know, it's worth bearing in mind that a long-form piece that I write, because I do long-form storytelling, I don't do sort of short to hard news. It may take the reader 15 minutes to read the article, but it could take me 6 weeks to write it. And yet a local newsroom is probably going to pay you for 2 days' worth of work in order to do that. There's no ways you can do that. And this model allows for slow, deep thinking. And unfortunately, you know, that's to advance a deep, well-researched piece, to advance a piece of difficult thinking around complex issues that we're all talking about complex issues. It can only happen if you have time. So the joy of not having to pay for a home office and a bond anymore and only have to pay my car off is that it allows me to stay in the field permanently. But I'm in the field 24/7, and it's pretty exhausting. I never switch out of work mode, and I had a flat tire on my way here this morning. The fourth of the year.
Thank you so much. And Tokozo, if I may, we met and chatted a little bit yesterday. Much of your work now weaves indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage into conservation storytelling. How can journalists use indigenous voices to make conservation stories more impactful?
So I don't actually have the answer to that right now, because I think I'm at a place where I'm walking so that others can run after me. For me, when I was working on 50/50, there were a lot of stories that were kicked out of the episode because the community aspect of it made communities look bad. So this morning, when I saw the talk about the nappies in the Limpopo River, and I just remember having done that story before in 50/50, and I remember it being kicked out of the episode because we were told we were always making communities look bad. And that was my departure point, because they look bad because they don't understand the way that we are approaching climate and conservation communication, because we come from a very urban, a very academic perspective. And so my work on that, it started in 2018, and it's such a slow burn because firstly, you're dealing with communities who have a history of being exploited. So it's not easy for them to welcome you into their spaces. Then you're dealing with traditional and cultural protocols. The traditional leaders need to know where you are coming and why you're here. And you don't just pop them an email and say, hey, can I come over? You've got to have meetings. And then when you're a woman, in some of them, I remember being told I can't come back because I saluted the chief. And women don't salute the chief. And after 6 months of begging to come back, so you have to do those things just to get to the story, right? And when you've harvested it, because so much of indigenous knowledge relies on oral history, and so much of oral history has been lost, it's only the elders, the really elderly, that know what we're talking about when you're talking about managing ecosystems, or because they don't think of it in terms of it's not important. Well, they can't connect heat waves and floods to anything that they are doing or the way that they are living, but they know that the way that we used to do things when I was a child and the way that the youngsters are doing things now is very different. And the one key thing that I found is that they may not be scared of the rhino becoming extinct. But if the rhino is an animal that is connected to their family history and they knew that, they would be scared of their forebears, they would be scared of doing wrong to their cultures and traditions. And so that's the perspective that I'm currently working on harvesting indigenous knowledge so that we can find solutions. Then I take it to academics. I work with, in the Eastern Cape, I work in many places, but the Eastern Cape is my favorite place to work in. And I work with some academics, some professors at Rhodes University, and we go through, it's not peer reviewed, so we go through what's usable and what's not, and then we go back again and all of that. But what's equally important to me is that there's knowledge that gets to them in a manner where we are not coming across as we're saving them. So the two work hand in hand, and there's a balance. The other thing is that the media through which they consume this information is not the same as in urban environments. So they don't have internet and social media, and many of them can't read or write. So radio has become a very useful tool for me. And I dabbled into using the national broadcaster from a television point of view, but that didn't work because of that expecting things to be done in 2 days that actually take 6 months to extract. So yeah, I'm hoping that more of us can get into the space, and then things can work a little bit quicker and we can get more out of the communities.
Thank you so much. Soko, if you wouldn't mind, your science communications background is particularly interesting, and I wanted to ask you how you're able to make complex research understandable to the wider public without sacrificing accuracy.
Okay, my initial response would be I did maths and science in school. So, and education is a very big part. Not to look down on any of my colleagues, but a lot of journalists don't take maths and science seriously. So when you get into these spaces, science, conservation, technology is always a boring subject. Technology may be a bit better because all the rich innovators are behind technology, but no one sees the value of doing science and what it means to you, and how you can bring it down to a local community level. So that's where it should begin. It should start at the education phase. When we start saying maths and science, and the reason why we're pushing it is that you understand how to interpret findings, how to interpret research. Why does this affect you? And then I used that working in the newsroom as well. One of the things we're always told is that you need to speak to people at the level that they are in. They used to tell us, how will your grandmother understand the story? Doesn't mean your grandmother is illiterate or doesn't know better. She's from a different era. So how do you break down the information you have to that person? So that's how I go into it. And then what I'd explain to scientists as well is just, what brought you into this field? When you find out why someone is doing their research, that's where you get the story. And that's the story. So that's how I used to approach it.
I think that's a great reply. Thank you. I'd like to start off, if I may, just putting a question to the panel, and we don't have a conch to pass around, but if you could wave your arm in the air or something to that effect. What storytelling techniques have you seen working well in making science and conservation engaging, accurate, and accessible to broad audiences? So I'm trying to get a sense of an approach and a technique that essentially helps not sugarcoat the medicine, but helps communicate.
I'm a big fan of cross-media collaborations. I did it a lot when I was producing on 50/50. We would get stories from print media organizations and then dig deeper and broadcast those stories. And then, because 50/50 was on the SABC and they've got a plethora of radio stations, PBS stations, then we would disseminate that information into smaller radio package pieces in multiple languages. And for me, I thought that was a big success, and it's something that since I've left 50/50, I always try to do in any other project that I do. So if I'm doing a film project, I want to see, now it's a little bit different because of the type of work that I do, but if I could do road shows where I could screen some of the material and followed by like roundtable discussions about what did we see, how does it impact this community? So it's more physical rather than, print media and television media, but where there's a collaborative effort between different types of mediums, I think it's a very successful means of communication.
Leonie?
This is where I get so excited. It's just good old-fashioned storytelling. So, in fact, it's Lee Baumgartner gave us an excellent example, a demonstration of what journalists say we should do, is show, don't tell. So, for instance, if we had written a hard news story about what Lee was talking about, we would have said, this river in Australia had this number of fish die off in a matter of hours for the following reasons. But the show, don't tell approach is to tell a story around it. And we saw how Lee did that. And this is what I try and do with all of my stories. So, for instance, the Karoo Dust Bowl series that I've just done for the Daily Maverick, this looks at all the different forces that are driving dust bowl conditions in Namaqualand, and I probably referenced 50 different academic papers They aren't all referenced in the articles, but the articles are structured around stories of people living in that context. So it's looking at, the livelihood implications, the conservation implications, and you kind of have to read and absorb that method of storytelling in order to understand what it is. But Lee gave a really great demonstration. There's neuroscience to support the fact that when we can identify with the content, we have an empathetic response to it, and we connect with it, and we are more likely to engage. We're not going to reach people through the head, we're going to reach them through the heart. And there's tons of literature to support why that works, and it comes down to the fact that we've got mirror neurons in our brains. So when we tell a story about how it hurts when you fall down a slope and crack your knee open, that's much more impactful than saying so-and-so needed a few stitches because they broke their knee, It's just good old-fashioned storytelling, and we were telling stories before we even had the marks to write stories down on paper or papyrus or whatever.
So cool.
I would say in spaces where I've seen it work really well is where people use animation, where you build characters around a certain theme. It attracts the children. Children are naturally the first, if you're a parent, that's your first point of call. They're always telling you what they've learned today. So if you can just make the message appeal to the children, they then, take it forward. I think if you think about the recycling story, when schools started giving civvies, because children love civvies, and you said if you were to collect this many cans, this many newspapers, this many things, it's the children that drive that, changed action. So I think that's where it's worked, and I think we should look at how do we do that with other conservation efforts that need the backing of people.
Fantastic. Building on that, to what extent do you think public interest should shape the stories we tell? And by that, I think a conference like this is a great example where one perhaps is not aware of something, becomes aware of it, and it becomes suddenly so clear why it's so important. Should the audience dictate the stories we tell, or should we make damn sure they hear what needs to be heard?
So I don't know if we should let the audience dictate the stories we tell, but there's value in allowing, in looking at what the audience is consuming. I say this because I've seen in South America, they set like whole telenovelas against the backdrop of climate change. And the love story is there, and the melodrama is there, but the backbone of the story is a climate crisis, right? So somebody who's into telenovelas, but not so much into climate conversations, gets to get the information that way. So I think we should look at audience trends and patterns to see what they're consuming, how they're consuming it, and see if we can weave climate stories and conservation stories into that. I'm a bigger fan of that than them dictating what we should tell, because I think from a journalistic point of view and access to the scientists and the academics that work with these materials, we are in a better position to know what's important for the audience to know rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I think it's very much a bit of both, and it's about really intelligently engaging on a moment-by-moment basis. So we mustn't be sort of paternalistic and come in and tell people what we think they should know. I think we need to have conversations, kind of what you were saying. Understand what people need to know, understand what their own concerns are, and then, tailor-make stories within that. An example would be, for instance, you were talking about the nappy question. I've just done a whole series of articles on nappy pollution in rural farming communities in the Eastern Cape. And the framing is around how the community themselves are trying to address the nappy question. But the framing is that this community has no options. There are no reusable nappies available. There's no water for them to wash. All they have access to is a disposable nappy, and the municipality can't come in and clear the nappies. So they throw it in the veld and hope that nature will take its course. And it's undermining It puts E. coli into the system, it undermines grasslands health, livestock health, and the whole local economy. But what are they supposed to do? So my framing of these stories was, there's a systemic problem here. Like, why are we not holding the Huggies and all these other big corporations accountable for the fact that they only stock single-use nappies in these shops? This is a systemic problem. And this brings me back to one of the essential problems with journalism right now and why we failed on the climate question. We don't need more journalism where you have reporting that just cheerleaders those who play by the rules of the game. We need deep investigative reporting that challenges the rules of the game itself. And I tried to do that with a nappy story. Like, why are we as active citizens allowing a system where single-use nappies are getting pushed into our environment every single day? Why are we allowing big corporate interests to drive this aspect that is undermining our grasslands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Sorry.
Got it. So cool.
Um,
Oh, there we go.
I think I'll just echo what my colleagues have said. It's a bit of both. You know, you only know what you know. So do you tell people what they need to know or what they already know about? And it just depends on what your mission is at that time. What is the point of telling people these things? But I do really agree with what you're saying in terms of the cheerleader journalism that's going on. And I mean, it's a myriad of reasons. These are the people who pay our salaries. So, you know, if they invite me and they tell me, hey, it's what I've done, that's what I'm going to report about. I think it takes great guts, strong leadership in the newsrooms for people to say, ask the difficult question. I think we see it a lot in politics sometimes, but I think the desire is not there for the subject matters that actually matter. And I think that's what we need to go back to. Just a little story that happened to me last week. Years ago, there used to be a campaign on SABC that says the next biggest war will be around water. No one cared about that until things started happening. Yes. You know, you had Day Zero in Cape Town, then that went away. Last week, I live in Johannesburg, and we had no water for a week. We were standing in high-rise buildings with buckets. The people were asking, but I don't have a bucket, that's why I live here. And, you know, we had to now think about how the rural person living in a rural community is walking several miles to go get water, put on their head. I was like, I'm not doing that. But I understood, and I think at that time, that was the prime time for any journalist to actually show that, because now you're seeing that what you've been running away from in the rural area has come to you. It's now at your doorstep. What are you doing about it? Are you finding out why there's no water? What needs to be done? How do the systems work? Do we know enough about these subject matters to hold anybody accountable to say, it shouldn't take this long, this should have been done it this way? But we don't know that because that's not the, you know, that's not the cause that we're always being bombarded with most of the time.
We're running out of time fast, but I hope I can give you each roughly a minute to answer a question which I think will hopefully benefit many in the room, and that is, how can scientists and journalists partner in ways that support in-depth reporting on climate and conservation?
Please, can scientists partner with me? Because I've just got a bunch of information that I need verified all the time. And my information from one source could need an entomologist, an ornithologist, an archaeologist, need a lot of scientists. So please, I'm available. Take my number. Speak to me after this.
Yeah, I mean, just build relationships. I mean, my entire career is founded on profoundly trusting relationships with experts. My job is not to be a PR person for the scientist, but to build a process where we understand each other. I understand your methodology, you understand mine, we respect it, and we work together for the common good. The story is bigger than the individual.
Absolutely.
It's building relationships, looking at each other as equals. I think we do fall in the trap where journalists look at scientists as buffs, geeks, and, you know, you can't speak to these people. And in turn, scientists look at us as dumb. I mean, and that we cannot, you know, relay the information. But when you get to know people on a personal level, that's the first barrier. Make the relationship, find out why do you do this? Why should I care? And then that's how you build the information, knowledge, and the repertoire that we need.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. I'd just like to thank my new friends and specifically for sharing their insights with us. And I'd also like to thank you all for joining us at the 14th Oppenheimer Research Conference, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and your team for a very refreshing discussion. Whilst the stage is still being prepared, could I ask Naledi Zama to please come up for presentation? Naledi will be talking to us about the potential of legume cover crops to improve soil acidity and nutrients in South African sugarcane fields.
Hi, everyone. So, I'm sure we've all found ourselves in a situation where we've eaten too many sweets, too many pizzas, croissants, milk tarts, all those things. And you look in the mirror and you're like, no, that is not my stomach, and those are not my cheeks. So that happens to many of us. And then you find yourself in a situation where you're like, okay, maybe I need to go on a diet. I need to eat broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, just all those unappetizing type of stuff, you know? And you have no choice because you have to do it, or else you'll be in trouble, okay? So now I want you to imagine soils. Soils in the sugarcane fields of KwaZulu-Natal have been on what I call a high nutrients, a high acid, low nutrient diet. So what does that mean? It means that these soils need to go on a diet. But of course, soils are not people, we need to help the soils. So what is a possible solution for this? We need to think of a sustainable approach that we can use to help these soils detoxify. And one of the solutions that are known is the use of cover crops. And that is what I'm going to be telling you guys about today. My name is Naledi Zama. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Global Change at Soplaki University. Sugarcane, which is scientifically known as Saccharum officinarum, is one of South Africa's most important crop. In KwaZulu-Natal, most of the smallholder farmers are situated in the provinces of Mpumalanga and KwaZulu-Natal. And these provinces, or rather the plantations, fall within two vegetation types. Mainly it's the Maputo land coastal belt and KwaZulu-Natal coastal belt grassland. Now, when you plant sugarcane, you plant it for a long amount of time. And this is bound to have negative effects on the soil, right? So now, what people normally do is they think, okay, let's just put fertilizers. That's the best way to get nutrients back into the soil, which is not the best thing to do all the time, especially because you want to think of cost-effective solutions that do not involve a lot of money, because a lot of these smallholder farmers actually don't have money for this, So one alternative that has been used for actually a long time, but sometimes the support for it is not there, is cover crops. Why? Why do you want to use cover crops when I could just sprinkle fertilizer on my field everywhere? Why do you want me to go and plant, Well, if you're a smallholder farmer, it's cost effective. And it does improve the soil health, and it also has other benefits such as reducing weeds, and also assisting in reducing the soil acidity. So there are other benefits that you should consider. But of course, smallholder farmers have a lot of issues, so we can't just spring this on them. We need to support why this is important, and we need to provide evidence as to why this would work. I'm just going to briefly discuss 3 hypotheses that I'll be getting into later on. But the first one is just that I expected that there will be differences in the climatic conditions and the soil fertility in the 2 vegetation types. So the Maputaland coastal belt and the KwaZulu-Natal coastal belt grassland. And secondly, when we plant these cover crops or these legumes, will the soil get better? In other words, will the soil nutrients increase, or will we find a situation where soil quality is still declining and boohoo, And lastly, what happens to the soil pH? Because soil pH is very important in sugarcane production as well. So for this study, students went and collected soils from 5 smallholder rain-fed sugarcane fields in Mpembeni, Mvuchini, Gigindlovu, Mzinto, as well as Hebedine. These plantations are within the 2 vegetation types that I already described. So then they selected 6 cover crops, which are sort of known to either be used as cover crops in sugarcane plantations, so they increase soil nutrients, they are tolerant of high or a high range of soil pH levels, or they're even drought tolerant, which is a big one. So these species on table 1, as you can see, we have our 2 Vicia species, Arachis, Harpagenia, Mucuna puriens, Cajanus cajan, and Vina angusilata. So what the students did is they planted these plants in pot plants from the soils collected from these plantations, and then they waited for 90 days, they harvested the plants, and then they rechecked the soil status of the soils and as well as the pH, and they also looked at microbial activity and bacteria. But today I will not be getting into any of the bacteria, microbial information, but they did consider this as well. What did they find? So the orange bars represent the KwaZulu-Natal coastal belts points, and it seems as if the plantations in these, this vegetation type had higher soil pH, higher nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, as well as magnesium. And if you look at the exchangeable acidity, there's an opposite effect, and that's because soil pH has an inverse relationship with soil pH. Secondly, just to show some values here, you see that the sites in the Maputaland coastal belt had an average pH of about 4.75, which is slightly lower than the KZN coastal belt grassland. And then you see an opposite effect now where the soil exchangeable acidity is higher in the Maputaland coastal belt. If we look at our principal component analysis here, we see that the plantations themselves also differ in terms of their sort of nutritional status, as well as their pH, as well as total precipitation and average temperatures. So the TP there and the AMT represents precipitation and temperatures. You see as well on your right that the vegetation types again seem to be moving further and further apart in terms of their status. So the KZN coastal belt vegetation type points, which are the ones in red, are highly associated with higher pH contents, potassium, magnesium, phosphorus, etc. Whereas the Maputaland coastal belt points have higher rainfall and also higher exchangeable acidity and are probably associated with lower nutrients. Secondly, now we want to find out, okay, once we've planted these legumes in the soils, does the soil nutrients, do they change? And if they change, in what direction do they change in? It looks like for soil nitrogen and soil phosphorus, the addition of the cover crops, or the legumes in this case, decreased these soil macronutrients. So if you look at the gray dashed line, that shows no effect. And if the error bar is on the left, it means that it had a significantly negative effect, whereas if the bar is on the right, it had a significantly increasing effect. And if you look at potassium now, by Vicia sativa, we see that It's just after the dash, but not really, so it's overlapping. But it is promising because it suggests that this species might have the potential to increase soil potassium in the soils. However, because among scientists here, p-values are important. This was not a significant result. It was a positive result, just not significant. And then we look at the pH and the exchangeable acidity. And again, we see here that soil pH increased after we've planted these legumes. And then the opposite effect again, all the legumes reduced soil exchangeable acidity, okay? And now if you take a look at figure 9, here, this is just a scatter plot to show the relationship between the soil pH as well as exchangeable acidity. And what it shows you is that if you look at the black points, like the black dots there, those are the soils before planting, so the pre-treatment soils. Those soils seem to have fairly lower acidity, lower pH levels, and higher exchangeable acidity, So there's clearly a problem in the soils in these sugarcane fields. And as soon as you're able to plant these legumes, you start to see a shift now where, okay, depending on which species you're looking at, obviously, the soil pH starts to increase and the exchangeable acidity declines as well, which is what you want, because if pH is generally higher, then a lot of the nutrients become more readily available. And then if you look on your right, that is a quadrant plot. So it's just a plot that shows you where you want to be as a soil. So if you're a soil, you want to be at the green part there. That shows the improved soils. So these are the soils that are generally in an area where the pH is greater than 5 and the exchangeable acidity is fairly low, okay? So that's where you want to be. And if you look closely, we do have a lot of legumes that are in the improved soils section. And that's promising because it means that those soils are better because these legumes now have been planted. So you see species there such as Mucuna pruriens, velvet bean, and you might not see clearly, but Vicia sativa is also just overlapping on some of the points there. And you also see some orange, so yeah, Vicia sativa, and a little bit of, I think it's Vina angusulata. Where you don't want to be is in the red quadrants, so in the top left. Those are where all your bad soils are. Okay, so you see a lot of red points there as well. Those red points represent the initial soils. So now we can tell that, okay, the initial soils in the sugarcane fields was actually slightly acidic and had high exchangeable acidity, which is not great, right? And then again, it's clear that I clearly like scatter plots, but yes. So figure 10 here is another scatter plot again, but this time we have overlaid this with sugarcane sites, so the sites themselves. I put this here because I also want to say that we do not know the history of these sugarcane fields, so there might be management techniques that they've been using that may explain some of the differences we see in the sugarcane fields themselves. But what does stick out is that there are sites, for example, Mvuchini, shown by the black points. That site, the soils there, have high exchangeable acidity and the pH is towards the lower end. So that's the site where possibly they need to consider getting the soil into a better, nutritional status. They need to consider what they need to do next. They need to think carefully. And then on figure 11 here, I just drew this so that you can also see some of the differences between the two vegetation types. So what do we mean here? What does this all mean? What it means is that, firstly, the nutritional status as well as the pH will be affected by the vegetation type in which the sugarcane field falls in. Okay, that's something that is just, we've shown that with some of the results. Secondly, the legumes reduced nitrogen and phosphorus, and only Vicia sativa was able to slightly increase potassium content. But why is this? Because we expected it to increase. It could be because these plants, they also need these nutrients to grow, They were harvested after 90 days. Possibly what could have been done is that we could have extended the 90 days to maybe 120 days. So just before the plants start to flower as well. Maybe then we could have seen an increase in the soil primary macronutrients. I say this because if you look at the documents that are supplied by SASRI, South African Sugarcane Research Institute, they indicate that a lot of these flowering plants have, they start to flower after between 90 days and 150 days. And that's when you want to cut down your cover crops when you are using them, because you don't want them to invest all of the nutrients now to flowering or to seeds or pod production. You want them to, you want to cut them, you want the leaves and everything to drop down, decompose, add the nutrients back into your soils, and then you replant your sugarcane. And again, I think we've really described the relationship between the pH and the exchangeable acidity. And overall, the species that seem to be the best performing species are the Vicia sativa species. So both of the veg species seem to do quite well. But of course, this all depends on the smallholder farmer. There are many options. You've got summer crops and you've got winter crops, which you can utilize. And that depends on your planting regime. I'd like to acknowledge the students who actually collected the soils, which was Kanye Sokwela, Ncedi Simtawunge, as well as Emihle Ngonini, as well as their supervisor and our collaborator, Professor Anati Magadlela, and these organizations, and the Oppenheimer Research Committee for allowing me to present in front of you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naledi, for the talk. One question I think we have time for if anyone has one. If they're quick, maybe you can do two.
Thank you very much, Naledi. I'm Mary Scholes from VIS. So there's 2 points I'd like to make. One is relative to other parts of the country where similar crops are grown. The exchangeable acidity in the soils that you are working in is absolutely negligible. You don't need to worry about it at all. So I wouldn't go to the trouble of putting legumes in to do anything about impacting the pH or the exchangeable acidity. But what does surprise me, and I'd like you to comment, is why did the addition of legumes reduce the soil nitrogen and phosphorus? Thank you.
Okay, so the only thing I can think of, to be honest, is that when I was reading documents supplied by SASRI, they indicated that when you are using these cover crops, you should cut them, or mow them rather, after about 150-ish, between 90 and 150-ish days, depending on the species. And these plants, I know that they were harvested, I think, at about 90 days. Right? So I'm assuming that maybe the plants, the seedlings were still using some of the nitrogen in the soil to grow and develop first, and that maybe it's likely that because of that, they were utilizing too much of the nitrogen, and that's why at that point, the nitrogen levels were low. I do believe there's another reason, but at the moment, that is the only reason we can think of. I am aware that there are students who look at the changing nitrogen levels over many days. So they have intervals where they have 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and 150 days, just to determine if, are there any changes in the nitrogen status? Is it affected by time? So, yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Naledi.
you.
And to the other lady over there, maybe you can catch her outside. If I could possibly call upon Ben Ashton to come forward, please. Ben is going to talk about understanding the cognitive consequences of climate change in wild animals.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to bring together a body of work that my collaborators and I have produced over the last 5 years or so, which is seeking to understand the cognitive consequences of a warming climate in wild animals. and was showcased by Andrew's talk on Wednesday morning and Shannon's talk earlier today, with the fantastic research that the Hot Birds Project has produced. The consequences of a warming climate for birds are both numerous and far-reaching. It's well documented that climate has had direct impacts on phenological processes. For example, many bird species are migrating and breeding earlier in response to warmer temperatures arriving earlier in the year. And these phenological shifts can create mismatches between breeding times and peak food availability, such as insect emergence. Species have also altered their behavior in response to warming climates. Interspecific interactions, social behavior, and foraging behavior have all been affected by changing climates and resource distributions. These behavioral shifts can help buffer against these stresses, but they may also increase energy expenditure and competition. The physiological consequences of climate change are particularly well characterized, particularly in southern African birds. Rising temperatures and extreme weather affect metabolism, thermoregulation, and water balance, resulting in extreme physiological stress. And warmer and drier conditions can also affect reproductive success by affecting food availability, egg viability, and chick survival. In some species, breeding queues can become mistimed with optimal foraging conditions, lowering reproductive output. And extended heat waves and prolonged droughts can cause widespread mortality and even mass die-offs in bird populations. And species unable to escape or adapt to these events can face sharply reduced survival and elevated extinction risk. And of course, these climate-driven shifts in survival and reproduction alter bird population sizes, age structures, and migration dynamics. And over time, these demographic changes can reshape community composition and ecosystem balance. And whilst it's crucial that we continue to investigate the effect of climate change on these parameters, I'm going to talk about a largely overlooked consequence of climate change, and that's the cognitive consequences of a warming climate. So before moving on, I should probably attempt to define cognition. Cognition is somewhat of an abstract construct, but I think the most useful definition is one coined by Sarah Shuttleworth, who describes cognition as the processes by which animals acquire, process, and store and act on information from the environment. And although this is a very broad definition, I also think it's very useful as an umbrella concept because it encompasses all the internal mechanisms and all the internal information processing that underpins adaptive animal behavior. But why should we care about cognition, and why should we care about the cognitive consequences of a warming climate? Well, an increasing body of literature is demonstrating that cognition is associated with a number of factors crucial to survival. Individuals with higher cognitive abilities often achieve and maintain higher social status, and this comes with a raft of benefits, including monopolization of breeding, alloparental care, and improved access to resources such as food and shelters. A number of studies have also found that cognitive performance is positively associated with anti-predator behavior. Cognitively skilled birds can detect, learn, and respond to predators more effectively, recalling past experiences, and this can modify their escape tactics. And believe it or not, cognitive performance is also positively associated with reproductive success. Advanced cognition enables better mate choice, better nest defense, and improved parental care. And cognition also plays an important role in resource acquisition. Cognitive flexibility helps birds locate, remember food sources across changing environments, and innovative behavior, such as tool use, allows individuals to exploit novel environments that less skilled individuals cannot. And crucially, cognitive performance has been found to be directly linked to survival. Enhanced cognitive capacity is positively associated with long-term survival and lifespan as it promotes adaptive decision-making. So cognition mediates this relationship between environmental changes and individual fitness trajectories. So given the potentially profound implications of impaired cognition, my collaborators and I sought to determine the relationship between heat stress and cognitive performance. And we hypothesized that heat stress could impact cognition differently depending on the age of the birds. In adults, we predict that heat stress will primarily lead to short-term impairments in cognitive performance. Elevated body temperature can reduce attention, slow reaction times, and impair working memory. And this is all hypothesized to have knock-on effects for cognitive processing. Adults are likely to have passed developmentally sensitive periods, so we also predicted that heat stress is unlikely to result in long-lasting plastic cognitive changes. However, repeated or prolonged exposure to heat stress may result in latent cognitive impairment that appears later in life. Conversely, we predict juveniles will be particularly sensitive to the effects of heat stress because their brains are still developing. So much like adults, we predict that exposure to higher temperatures will affect attention, memory, and learning, but we also predict that these effects are going to be longer lasting and potentially carry on into later life. And juveniles are also behaviorally naive, and they're less capable of self-regulating behaviors such as resting or heat dissipation behaviors. So this further amplifies their vulnerability to heat stress. So to help understand the effects of heat stress on cognition, Camilla Saravia, a former PhD student of mine and Mandy Ridley's, carried out a series of experiments on a study population of southern pied babblers located at the Kuruman River Reserve in the Kalahari. And this study population was established by Mandy in 2007, and barring a COVID-enforced interruption, has been continuously monitored since. And the majority of individuals in the study population are ringed and therefore individually identifiable. And we have very detailed life history information for all of the individuals as well. So we have a genetic pedigree, we have longitudinal information about their social environment, and importantly, we have longitudinal information about environmental parameters as well. As the location of the study site would suggest, pied babblers are found mainly in semi-arid savannas. They're highly territorial and social. They live in social groups of 2 to 15 individuals, and they're cooperative breeders. So the dominant pair monopolizes breeding, whilst subordinates assist with feeding, incubating, and defending the chicks. But importantly, their breeding is entirely contingent on environmental conditions, namely rainfall and food availability. So they're particularly vulnerable to climate change. So in order to investigate the relationship between heat stress and cognition, we needed to quantify an ecologically relevant cognitive trait. And we chose associative learning, which is the process by which animals form an association between two stimuli, or between a behavior and its consequence. And it's ecologically relevant for birds because it enables them to flexibly adjust their behavior in response to environmental changes. So, for example, associating certain foods with palatability or specific sounds with predators. And to quantify associative learning, we presented individuals with an associative learning task, which consisted of a wooden foraging grid containing 2 wells covered with either a light green lid or a dark green lid. And one of these lids was randomly assigned to be the rewarded well, whereby when the babblers pecked the well and it swiveled, they could gain access to a food reward, which in this case was a mealworm. And the babblers were considered to have passed the task when they chose the rewarded well in 10 out of 12 consecutive trials, which represents a significant deviation from binomial probability. So the measure of cognitive performance was the number of trials it took the individuals to reach this learning criterion. And I'll show a video of one of the trials. So you can see the babbler approach the task. It has a quick look at the dark green lid before it probes the light green lid. And it's hard to see in the video, but it did get its mealworm. So that particular individual passed that task, or that trial, I should say. To determine the effects, or the short-term effects, of heat stress on cognitive performance, we explored the relationship between the number of trials taken to pass the task and the temperature at the time of testing. And here's what we found. On the y-axis is the number of trials taken to pass the task. It's important to note here that a higher number corresponds to worse performance. And on the x-axis is the maximum temperature during testing. And as you can see, as the temperature increases, there's a corresponding increase with the number of trials taken to pass a task. So quite convincing evidence that there is a short-term effect of heat stress on cognitive performance. As mentioned earlier, because the study population is being continuously monitored since 2007, we have this detailed life history information and detailed information about environmental parameters, including temperatures experienced during the nestling phase and developmentally sensitive time periods. So we were able to test adults in the study population, but investigate the effect of rearing conditions on cognitive performance later in life. And complementing the results I just showed you, we found a significant effect of environmental temperatures during the nestling period on cognitive performance later in life. So again, on the y-axis is the number of trials taken to pass the associative learning task, but on the y-axis is the maximum temperature experienced during the nestling phase. And as you can see, as the maximum temperature increases, so does the number of trials taken to pass a cognitive task. So again, quite convincing evidence that the environmental conditions experienced early in life has lasting consequences for cognitive phenotypes. And given the widely reported link between cognition and fitness-related behaviors, we predict the consequences of heat-induced cognitive impairment for the babblers to be profound, both in the short term for adults and in the long term for juveniles. However, the findings of this research has implications that extend beyond the focal species. Pied babblers are famous for their interspecific interactions, underscoring their importance for their role in the Kalahari. These interspecific interactions include parasitism, mutualism, and obviously competition between species, but both with avian and non-avian fauna, such as cuckoos, meerkats, and drongos. So heat-induced cognitive impairment is therefore likely to have profound consequences, not just for the babblers, but also for the wider avian and non-avian community that interacts with them as well. And zooming out further, it's important to understand if what we've found in the babblers is indicative of a broader spatial pattern of heat-induced cognitive impairment, a pattern that could reshape how we think about animal resilience, behavior, and survival in a rapidly warming world. And in this vein, complementary research we've carried out on Australian magpies suggests that this pattern of heat-induced cognitive impairment is occurring on a wider scale, particularly in areas of climate change hotspots. So here you can see that cognitive performance in the Australian magpies, which again was an associative learning task, is significantly impaired in heat stress conditions compared to non-heat stress conditions. However, in order to gain a complete understanding of the cognitive consequences of climate change and the cascading effects this may have on fitness-related behaviors and ultimately population viability, research on long-term study systems is essential, and I hope the results I've presented here today can convince you of that. So I'd just like to thank my fantastic collaborators. I'd like to thank Flinders University, the Australian Research Council, the FITS and the University of Western Australia for support, and I'd also like to thank the Oppenheimer family for organising yet another fantastic conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Unfortunately, we've fallen slightly behind time, so if you'd like to ask a question, perhaps if you could find him outside afterwards. Next up, I'd like to call on Mana Visaki, and she'll be talking about estimating large carnivore densities using spatial capture-recapture in the arid Tswalu Kalahari Reserve in South Africa.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mara Versaghi. I'm a final year master student with Nelson Mandela University, and today I will be presenting to you one of my data chapters. So, large carnivores are a highly charismatic endangered group of species, and their main threats include anthropogenic pressures, human-wildlife conflict, the loss of natural prey base, as well as the loss, habitat loss and fragmentation. So these pressures have diminished the ranges of many populations, often to the point where 64% of them, of carnivore populations, are threatened with extinction. 80% show declining population trends, and 60% have lost more than half of their historic ranges. So because of all these threats, many carnivore populations now rely on fencing for their protection. However, fencing brings in another set of management challenges, as within these fence systems, populations are isolated both demographically and spatially, and that allows for no natural dispersal, no immigration, and also very little opportunity for genetic flow. So this means that carnivores within fence reserves require active management and also ongoing monitoring to prevent either overpopulation or collapse. And that's where good data becomes critical, because good decisions need good counts. So accurate population density estimates are essential to guide management decisions, whether it's just adjusting the stocking densities, planning translocations, and also if you just want to mitigate conflict. So the problem is that many traditional methods, such as track counts and call-up surveys, often produce unreliable estimates or even non-comparable. And expert opinion, which is also often used, is subjective, and it also varies in accuracy, and it also often doesn't have confidence intervals. So this lack of consistency between the different methods makes it very difficult to compare density estimates between regions and also between reserves. So to manage fenced carnivore populations, we need survey methods that are standardized and that are repeatable and also reliable. And having these methods will produce reliable data for managers to make effective decisions. This brings me to the approach that we used, which is spatially explicit capture-recapture modeling, also known as SCCR, which has emerged as a robust and widely acceptable method used to estimate carnivore densities. And especially, it's also very effective when combining it with camera trapping. And these models use identifiable features such as coat spot patterns or whisker spot patterns to identify individuals. And by incorporating this spatial distribution of the detections across the camera grid, this models can estimate not only population abundance, but also how individuals are distributed within the reserve. So the spatial, so when we compare the SCCR models to the traditional methods, it provides us with a more reliable and statistically robust estimate. And it is also particularly well suited for wide-ranging cryptic carnivores such as leopard and hyena species. So the Northern Cape is South Africa's largest and least populated province, and it is dominated by mining and agricultural practices such as game ranching and sheep and cattle farming. And these activities have previously been linked to carnivore declines elsewhere in South Africa. And because species like hyenas and leopards are known to breach fences, this also puts them at risk when they are outside of fence-protected areas. So despite these pressures, very few SCCR estimates exist for carnivores in the Northern Cape. And without these reliable baselines, it's difficult to assess the population status, track their changes, and also to compare densities between regions. So this gap reinforces our central point that good decisions depend on good counts, and in regions like the Northern Cape, where these estimates are lacking, it is we need density estimates that are repeatable and reliable to be able to give managers data that they can base their decisions off of. So to address this regional knowledge gap, our study focused on Tswalo Kalahari Reserve, which is located in the Northern Cape. And Tswalo is the largest privately protected reserve in South Africa. The reserve is also divided into two sections, namely Legaba and Koranenburg, which our study focused on the Koranenburg section. So in Koranenburg, no lions are present. However, in Legaba, there are 2 lion prides. Also in Koranenburg, spotted hyenas were never considered resident. However, in 2020, up until 2020, they reintroduced a small clan. Brown hyenas have been considered resident on Tswalo. However, they've never been systematically monitored. And leopards have also naturally occurred on Tswalo. However, for the past decade, they were locally extinct. However, they have started recolonizing Tswalo. So prior to our study, no SCCR estimates were available for Tswalo, which left a site-specific knowledge gap in the reserve's carnivore management framework. And by establishing this robust baseline estimates, our work now provides a foundation for the long-term monitoring and management of Tswalo's carnivores. So to estimate the density, we deployed 85 paired camera trap stations across Koranenburg over a 4-month survey period, and a 9-kilometer square grid was placed over Koranenburg, where we then placed a camera trap station in each grid cell. And once the survey was complete, we extracted all the data manually to get the images of these 3 carnivore species. And also throughout the study period, we built identification kits for each species, which helped us to individually identify them using the paired camera stations as well as through field observations. And we managed to build complete identification kits for the spotted hyenas. However, for the leopard and the brown hyena, we only managed to build partial identity kits. So because of these partial identity kits, we then used the flank site that had the greatest number of identified individuals for the analysis for brown hyena and leopard. So for brown hyena and leopard, we also ran 4 separate models where we included distance to artificial waterhole, as well as camera trap placement in as covariates. And for spotted hyena, we ran the same 4 models. However, we added an additional model, which was additional covariate, which was distance to den site, as this is also known to influence the detection probability. Okay, to give you a quick overview of what our survey produced, we accumulated just under 10,000 trap nights and over 300,000 images. And from these images, we managed to extract 54 leopard images, 677 brown hyena images, and 165 spotted hyena images, which was then used for analysis. For all 3 species, we used the right flank, as that had the highest number of identified individuals. However, for spotted hyena, we were able to include both flanks because we had complete identification kits for them. And just in terms of the detection of these carnivores within the trap array, leopards were recorded at 18 camera stations, brown hyena at 74 stations, and spotted hyena at 50 stations. So the density estimate for these carnivores was then calculated, and for brown hyena, the estimate was 3.11 per 100 square kilometers, and here the detection was higher on roads than on game paths. For leopard, it was 0.18 individuals per 100 square kilometers, and here the camera traps that were placed on the game paths had higher detections than on roads. And for spotted hyena, the density was 0.66 per 100 square kilometers, and distance to den site and distance to artificial waterholes also influence the detection probability. So to place our results in context, we conducted a literature review of all available SCCR estimates in Africa for these 3 species. And then we also examined them based on the management system, so whether it was fenced or unfenced. And leopard densities are the most widely studied, particularly in South Africa, with estimates relatively evenly distributed between fenced and unfenced reserves. Brown hyena densities are also concentrated in South Africa, though most come from fenced reserves, which highlights that there's a big gap in unfenced systems. And spotted hyenas are the least studied, with only 3 SECR estimates available in South Africa for them, which includes this study. And this was also the first SECR estimate that was produced for the Northern Cape. So from this literature review, we then also we incorporated our results into this and to try and see where our densities fit in. And for the leopard density, we found that our estimate is the lowest recorded in a fenced system in Africa. But the positive finding is that leopards are successfully recolonizing Tswalu, which is quite a positive thing for their recovery. For brown hyena, our estimate was the 3rd highest in South Africa and the highest in the Northern Cape. Just for interest's sake, the 2 highest estimates are recorded in the Eastern Cape in Mountain Zebra National Park. And as brown hyenas are listed as near threatened by the IUCN, the high density at Tswalu highlights its role as a key refuge and contributed to population stability. For spotted hyena, the estimate remains scarce in fenced arid systems, and our study provided the first estimate for the Northern Cape. And it's also comparable to other unfenced systems in Malawi and Namibia. So while our study provided valuable insights, there are several limitations. And despite having these dual camera setups, we still ended up with a lot of single flank images, which likely led to a slight underestimation of the densities. And also the image quality posed quite a big challenge with low light conditions and also vegetation obstructing the spot patterns, especially in brown hyena, because you've got such a little place that when you identify them on their stripes, the grass often obstructs their leg stripes, so that was quite a bit of a challenge. So all of these factors likely led to a bit of an underestimation of the density. So when we began this work at Tswalu, there was very little reliable information on Tswalu's carnivore populations, and the management decisions often relied on assumptions rather than reliable data. And through this research, we've changed that by producing the first reliable estimates for their carnivore densities, which consists out of a standardized and repeatable method that enables managers to make effective decisions. And this also marks a significant shift for Tswalu, going from limited knowledge to a data-driven approach, giving managers a solid foundation for tracking the population trends and assessing the impact of management interventions. So beyond the numbers, the real value lies in the framework we've built, which is repeatable, consistent, and designed for long-term use, both within Tswalu and in other arid landscapes. And our findings also confirm that Tswalu is an important stronghold for large carnivores in the Northern Cape, especially for brown hyenas, and that the new baselines will support more effective management while contributing to a broader regional understanding of these carnivore species. And ultimately, this research has turned an information gap into a data-driven foundation for better conservation and management of large carnivores in arid ecosystems. Lastly, I would just like to extend my gratitude to the Nelson Mandela University, as well as the Wildlife Ecology Lab, and the Tswalu Foundation, as well as the Tswalu Kalahari Reserve, and the National Research Foundation and the Postgraduate Research Scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mana, for going through your presentation with 2 minutes to spare. I think it's only fair that we allow the audience to ask a question. Anybody? No? Okay. Thank you very much,
thanks.
Mana. Right. Now we have a tag team, Katie McKenzie and Lessa Mandoloma, who will be talking to us about human-centered conservation, communities at the core.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie McKenzie from JAMA Conservation and Communities.
And I'm Lessa Mandoloma, and I'm from Oxford University.
So we're going to be talking about human-centered conservation. I'll give a brief bit of context as to why we think it's so necessary to have an approach like this. Lessa will go into depth on what human-centered conservation really is. We'll have a couple of case studies of examples that really align to the approach we're talking about. It was actually really fantastic over the past couple of days to see so many presentations that already aligned so well with what we're thinking. In fact, on day one, Belinda's presentation, as we were watching it, we were like, this is exactly what we're thinking. So really gratifying to see that these kind of thoughts are happening in our spaces. All right, so this is a diagram from the Living Planet report in 2020. I'm sure it comes as no surprise to anyone, and I'm sure many of you have already seen this diagram. So it looks at the biggest threats to Earth's biodiversity, looking at changes in land and sea use, transforming wild spaces into city, agriculture, infrastructure, zones, etc. We're looking at species overexploitation, invasive species and disease, often unintentionally introduced, pollution, chemicals, plastics, etc., and climate change. These aren't working in silos, they're amplifying each other. So this map here, the red shows biodiversity loss over the past decades, and it's declining at an alarming rate. I'm sure no one here is surprised to hear that depressing statistic. The Living Planet report shows a 73% drop in monitored vertebrates from 1970 to 2020. And most of these areas are ones with very high biodiversity. So this is another map. It shows areas of extreme poverty, the percentage of people living in areas of extreme poverty. And poverty is declining globally. But it's still a huge concern, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see from this map. And actually, if you compare it to the map on the previous slide, you can see there's quite a significant overlap in those high biodiversity areas and the percentage of people living in extreme poverty in the African continent. And this is meaning that the most vulnerable people who often directly rely on natural resources for income, for food, for fuel, for medicine, and more, are often hit the hardest. So we spoke about the global need of conservation. We spoke about the global need of poverty alleviation. And these needs are often in tension. So conservation often occurs at the expense of those most disempowered and poorest. Local people are expected to protect wildlife with few resources and little power to do so. And it's not only human-wildlife conflict that we're talking about. Issues are food insecurity, drought, floods, health problems, unemployment, often underpinned by biodiversity loss. And it's not only tensions between humans and wildlife, it's tensions between human activities and wildlife, expanding cities, infrastructure, and agriculture conflicts with wild spaces. So many aspects of the current conservation models that we have today do stem from colonial models that excluded people from these wild spaces. And new approaches are moving us away from this. You see inclusive conservation, rights-based approaches, co-management, community-based natural resource management, specifically in Southern Africa. But still, conservation seems to be at odds with development a lot of the time. And actually, this is one of the same graphs that Belinda put up on the first day in her presentation. And it shows, I mean, we've had past successes, and we are still seeing successes in conservation. But there's this alarming decrease in biodiversity still. So where Belinda had the question mark there on how to bend the curve, we would see human-centered conservation as being that. So now I'm going to pass over to Lessa.
Thank you, Katie. One of the good things about being the last presenter is that you get to see all the previous presenters and you see how it resonates with your own research. And you will see that I'll keep referring to other people that have presented before because it so much resonates with what we're trying to do in human-centered conservation. So as Katie mentioned about this graph that's there, and I remember she called for a system-wide approach, a way to change the way we look at conservation, the way we do conservation, be it interventions or research. It's a call for reflection, a call to change how people and nature relate. And human-centered conservation does exactly that. It's a call for reflection. It's not a new framework. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel at all. We're trying to take what has worked well in the previous frameworks, be it CBNRM, be it other people-centered approaches, be it rights-based approaches, but it's that framework, it's that approach that is telling us to pause and reflect what has worked well, what can we do, and how can we upscale that to make sure that we have a win-win for people and nature. So this is what human-centered conservation is all about. It ashamingly puts people at the center of conservation. It's an approach that realizes that, yes, people can be or are the problem to conservation, but they are also the solution. It's very non-judgmental approach. It's very realistic because it puts people, especially the people that live around protected and conserved areas across different landscapes, be it in Samburu in Kenya, be it in Malawi, be it in Texas. It's a very flexible approach. You can either apply it in research, you can also apply it in conservation interventions, but at the end of the day, it demands that we ask 3 questions. The first question that human-centered conservation asks is, who defines conservation? How are goals of conservation decided? Who benefits from conservation initiatives, be it research, everything about conservation, who benefits from that? But also, from what Katie has mentioned about different working in silos, the trade-offs that are there, human-centered conservation is about communicating these trade-offs very explicitly and being able to have honest conversations about negotiations. How do we negotiate these kind of trade-offs in various landscapes? As a matter of definition, human-centered conservation is an approach that places rights, the knowledge, the needs and the leadership of people living around biodiverse landscape at the core of conservation practice. It also recognizes the shared responsibility of all people for sustaining the planet. One of the unique things about human-centered conservation is the duality, where you recognize that you want to benefit in terms of the people, but also in terms of the planet itself. So it also looks at the breaking down the silos, realizing that we all need each other. We all need to collaborate. We've been working in silos for too long, but human-centered conservation is about recognizing the interconnectedness between sectors. Sometimes in other areas, it's not about conservation, it's about health. In other places, it's about food security. In other places, it's about climate. And human-centered conservation brings all of that together, all of those sectors together, and see exactly how we can collaborate within the human-centered conservation partnership. So as you can see from the graph there in front of you, this is explaining the different conservation initiatives that are available across landscapes. Where it's saying human conservation failure is where we are trying to it's where we are running away from. This is a lose-lose situation. This is a situation where people lose and nature loses. And in most of the cases, it's either the conservation failure, ecocentric conservation, where in terms of ecological gain, it's up there, but then in terms of the people, they're down there. It's a loose gain, the same with anthropological gain, but human-centered conservation is right at that right quadrant. That's where we are all trying to, that's where we're going, basically. That's the future of human-centered conservation. It's about the humanity. It's about seeing not just the other person, but also redefining the relationship that people have with nature, trying to be at that place where we say nature can win, but also people can as well. We can all win, and we can all exist. There's enough place, there's enough space for all of us. It's an aspirational goal, but then we are moving away from the negative impacts that conservation have on people, but also the negative impact that conservation has on nature as well, or people have on nature as well. So we are developing different frameworks on how to basically measure. We do that already, but then we are doing it qualitatively in our own human-centered conservation partnerships, but we're in a process of developing robust metrics where whether it's a conservation initiatives or it's a conservation research or anything to do with conservation rather, how do we move from
all these quadrants to get to that place where we are calling human-centered conservation. Human-centered conservation is guided by what we call foundational principles, and we have about 7 of those. So it asks different questions, and these questions have been developed by already existing frameworks. Like, for example, you see that most of the foundational principles in front of you, they will look very similar to what we call a site-level assessment of governance and equity that was developed by SAGE, and also evidence toolkit. It calls for respectful engagement that fosters community and agreements with other stakeholders together. It calls for empowerment and education. It also reimagines and transforms conservation, where we are trying to have not just honest conversation, but also trying to redefine what is there. For example, in terms of capacity building, in human-centered conservation, we understand that other places do require to build capacity. But in most of the places where you and I come from, sometimes it's about sharing that capacity. And that's what human-centered conservation is all about, building those equitable relationships between people that have got different powers and that have got different privileges, to look at how do people and nature thrive across landscapes. We realize that we operate in a place or in landscapes that are full of challenges and full of barriers. And within human-centered conservation, it's about changing those barriers that became enablers on how we can effectively have win-win situations for people and nature. And one of those enablers is secure land tenure, because we realize in so many places, tenure is a very important aspect. Governance, whether political structures or other barriers that makes us fail to have win-win for nature. Strong governance, we realize it's very much an enabler for human-centered conservation. Cross-sector integration, it looks at climate, well-being, food security, climate, food security, as well as landscape, jurisdiction. All these are parts and parcel of what becomes human-centered conservation. It also looks at culture. What are the values of the people who live around landscape? And also the flexible financing. We know that financing is very much a challenge in a lot of conservation initiatives. We realize we cannot do this alone. So we do this in what we call human-centered conservation partnerships, and I will explain more about that. But here, I want to explain that it's very much aligned with all the global goals that we might be aware of in this room. Talk of CITES, IPBES, IUCN, Sustainable Development Goals, Global Framework, because they all call for ecological sustainability, land restoration, sustainable use, ecosystem and adaptation, gender equity. It's a systematic, wide approach in trying to resolve the challenges that we've been facing for the last decades. As I said already, that human-centered conservation, it's about taking different sectors that work together. And right now, these are the 5 areas where human-centered conservation partnerships are working in. Others are working in food security and sovereignty. That goes beyond access to food, but also how do people within these areas want to produce their own food? What about the rights to be in control of the food chains in their communities? We look at climate adaptation. We look at health and coexistence, nature-based economy, and landscape and jurisdiction. We can have other more areas, but currently these are the 5 areas that we are that we're working on in human-centered conservation. As I mentioned already, that we have a group of partnership. In front of you, these are the partners that are working on human-centered conservation in different aspects. We have Life Through Wildlife, we have got Suli, we've got Accra, all these some are working in research, and some are actually working on the ground, implementing different aspects of conservation that is winning for both people and nature. And we have case studies where real-world examples where human-centered conservation practice is being done, and Katie will explain a bit of those case studies.
Thanks so much. And definitely when we look at the foundational principles, they certainly seem quite overarching and high level. And this is necessary just because we're wanting it to apply to various different contexts. But within those different contexts, really being able to understand the criteria and metrics. So I'm not going to go on for too long on the next 2 case studies that we believe align very closely with human-centered conservation and meet those different metrics. And these are metrics not only for where the project is currently aligning and representing human-centered conservation foundational principles, but also where they could possibly be, understanding, okay, where are these pressure points that we can move forward on? So this is the welfare impact study. The reason I'm not going to go too much into depth is because Dilys Rowe already presented on the welfare study yesterday on a fantastic presentation, but it's really just understanding the welfare comparison between different types of deaths, and it's a great example of knowledge integration, bringing together vets, hunters, conservationists, welfare experts, and everyone in between, and really being able to connect to things like wildlife economy, to health, and going across sector. Similarly, with morally contested conservation, Dara did a presentation yesterday on this. I'm not going to go too much into depth on what it actually is, but it's looking at research on different perspectives on contested topics in conservation. It's looking at equity and rights, it's looking at local leadership, and it's not just technical or ecological challenges, but putting the people at the heart of conservation, understanding what are the people who are closest to nature actually thinking about conservation topics, and how does that differ from those who are living further away. And I'll pass back to Lessa to go a bit more in depth into a new case study that hasn't been presented already at this conference.
No, thank you very much, Katie. I'll just give you another example of how we applied principles of human-centered conservation in a research that was trying to look at food biodiversity challenge in Malawi. So this will give you an example of what we are talking about when we say integration of sectors. Because when we were looking at how do we reconcile food security and conservation in shared landscape where people and nature share the same or exist the same landscape, we realized that farmers are not just dealing with crops that are destroyed by wildlife, but they're also dealing with the effects of climate, the rainfall. They're also dealing with issues of pests and diseases. And then there's an issue of transport where some of these communities, they live right within the buffer zone where transporting their food products to and from the areas where they live, it's a much, much difficult challenge. And that was not all. There's I'm not sure if many of you know about Malawi, but harvesting most of the resources from the national park is very much illegal. But as we saw from that video, in these kind of landscapes, sometimes it's about survival. And people do illegally get things from wildlife, get things from the protected areas. And talk of markets, I've already explained about how difficult it is for the farmers to transport some of their products from where they live to the markets where they can sell these things. We had conversations, various conversations with different communities, men, women, looking at all the possibilities of how we can actually have a win-win for nature. And the answer for that is very, very complex. But there is a positive thing that came out of it, and that is people are willing to talk. They have so much knowledge. They have so much urgency. And it's not just about wildlife, it's also about people. And it's not just about people, it's also about wildlife. We cannot justify expansion of lands at the expense of ecosystem, but at the same time, we cannot also expand ecosystem at the expense of vulnerable people. We have to keep having honest conversations about equity and rights, but also realizing that within this landscape, you cannot separate food security and conservation. The lived realities of these communities is that these industries are as interconnected as they get. For that, human-centered conservation is not just a call to reflection, it's not just a framework, but it's a way of reimagining conservation and knowing that we can actually have a win-win, and we need to keep inspiring for that win-win. That is human-centered conservation, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and finishing early as well. I'm not sure if there's any questions. We do have, oh, great. In the corner over there.
Thanks very much. It was wonderful to see that example of the conceptual ideas I was talking about on the first day. Several of these case studies and the challenges you raise, make one realize how very complex these situations are that you're engaging in. And I agree that human-centered conservation is one of the main ways forward. But I wonder, you know, in several of these instances, you're dealing with what I would call social ecological traps, where there are so many variables and such path dependency at play that I'm wondering if you're thinking of employing any of the kind of systems thinking tools or approaches that help us understand why these situations have emerged. You know, there's complicated political and economic and social reasons behind this coincidence of people and biodiversity. It's not just a coincidence. So I was just wondering if some of your work is starting to look into understanding these threshold effects and how you might actually be able to leverage tipping points rather than just relying on sort of simple linear trade-off analysis in this work. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. It's a very good question. Yes, to answer your question, this is one of the things that we have tried to do for the past 5 years, and it's something we are still trying to build as well. And if you earlier on, we explained about how we're developing these robust frameworks to make sure that we are able to actually measure across landscapes how we can negotiate this kind of trade-offs, because we realize there are going to be these different trade-offs, and these trade-offs are going to look different across landscapes, and trying to making sure that we are aware how various landscapes and how human-centered conservation is going to look among and between different landscapes. That's a process that we're trying to do now.
Thank
Yes,
you.
thank you.
And also just to add to that as well, I think that's why it's so critical to us that we're not just looking at conservation frameworks and, you know, conservationists speaking about conservation and biodiversity, but making sure that we've got experts from different sectors. We've got frameworks from different sectors that are incorporating biodiversity and are looking at some of those aspects that maybe we don't cover in a purely conservation or biodiversity context.
I turned it back on, yeah. Thank you very much. Just a short question. Where would you put an endangered species into your framework? Thank you.
Where do we put endangered species in our framework? Where? In the right quadrant that we were talking about. That's the goal that we are going there. Where endangered species, non-endangered species, they all have a room to survive with the people.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? I think we have time for one more. Oh, right, jolly good.
Thank you for the presentation and highlighting the human-centered conservation awareness that we all should have. But there's in the past 3 days, we've learned so much about threats to our local conservation efforts. Mainly, if we look at, you know, the attentions on the effort on our rhino protection, the stress that's been put on the eel conservation efforts that's going to the Asian market. We learned about the pangolins that are traded, you know, mainly for ridiculous prices to the Asian market. My question, are you aware from a research and conservation point of view, because we work with a lot of global teams, global research teams, are you aware of any significant efforts in addressing the Asian human conservation awareness? And maybe talking to your one slide of global vision and local priority, to focus on that area as well for morally contested conservation.
Sorry, if it's possible to repeat that, I did not get. Yes, thank you.
Sorry. She's asked if you could repeat it.
Okay, I'm going to shorten it. We've learned from a few presentations this past 3 days on the threat from the Asian community and markets in terms of our local ecosystems, conservation efforts, and talking to your one slide where we spoke about you would ideally want to have a global vision with a local priority. Are you aware of any efforts that we should maybe think about focusing on Asian conservation awareness in terms of morally, you know, your morally contested conservation, because our eels, our rhinos, our pangolins, we've been noted that, you know, there's a threat from that market, and it's not driven by poverty necessarily.
Oh, yeah, okay, thank you very much. I do not have much knowledge about Asia, but I can talk about the areas that we have worked on. And when we say local priority and global vision, it goes back to the trade-offs that we were talking about, where we look at all these global goals being set, and then at the end of the day, you realize that it's a local people or it's a local communities that will, at the end of the day, be more important in making sure that we get there. I'll give an example of where you have a global goal of 30 by 30, for example, right? And then on the ground, you look at area of expansion, it's not there. So can we find other ways how we can negotiate this kind of trade-offs, not just recognizing that there are trade-offs, but also having these explicit and very honest discussions about equity and rights. If it's a global North organization, for example, they may have the power and the privilege, but where does that stop? Where do the local people have a voice? And how does that voice look like? How do their future look like? And it's about having those conversations. And that's why, in terms of human-natured conservation, we try to collaborate so that we explicitly communicate this kind of trade-offs.
And Lessa was best placed to answer that because she works very closely with the morally contested conservation project. But just from more of an outside view as well, I think it's so important to have research initiatives and programs like that that look towards the Asian market as well. As you said, numerous of the presentations in the last couple of days have looked at species that are affected by what's going on there. And so to be able to do something similar to what MCC has done, really understanding what's the perspectives, what are the reasons driving this from different types of people, different people in different geographic locations, is so critical.
Thank you so much, Katie and Lessa, for that. If we could all give them a round of applause, thank you. We now come to what could be somewhat of a lottery, I've been advised. There could be a prize for what's about to happen next. I don't know if you gentlemen were given a QR code to display on the screen. Ah, perfect. So we're now in the Have Your Say portion. And what I'd like to ask is that for the next 10 minutes, no more than that, you're all scientists, I'm sure you could figure it out in less time, you all answer questions about the conference, and somebody will get a prize. Don't know who. After that, we'll reconvene for the prize giving. So for the next 10 minutes, fill it in. And I hope that the people outside can hear this as well, because it would be nice if they could also fill it in. time to fill in the questionnaire. Thank you for that. And if I could at this juncture invite Mr. Nicky Oppenheimer on stage for the prize giving. Could I possibly first ask Professor Andrea Fuller to join us on stage? She is the leader of our esteemed panel of judges and has put in a lot of hard work in making the decisions of our prize winners here today. So. Now we'll get on to the poster section. We will call out third, second, and first, and if they could come up in that order to receive their prize. So in third position is Maine Reynolds. In second position is Chafika Piri. And in first place is Cilias van der Merwe. He's running away with the floating trophy.
No, you can take it as long as it comes back.
Ah, okay, jolly good. Now we're going to go with the best student presentation, student speed talk. Out of 7 talks, the winner is Lauren van Dijk. We'll now move on to best presentation, student postdoc talk. Out of 15 talks is Merlin Nkomo. And last but not least, most outstanding contribution, mid-senior career presenter. The prize goes to Lee Baumgartner. Thank you to all of our participants.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming towards the closing parts of another extraordinary conference. And I'd like to call upon Jonathan to do the honors and do the necessary to close us down, even though there is another session after lunch, so don't disappear.
No, thank you. And I think we've had the most extraordinary 3 days. And, you know, this is where Duncan began things. This is the 14th of the Oppenheimer Research Conferences. And the venue has changed, the number of people has changed, the detail of the presentations, I believe, has improved. But most importantly, the principles behind the ORC have not changed. And what we are here about is being multidisciplinary by bringing different lines of thought into the same space, having a single plenary space where those ideas have to be heard by people who spend the vast majority of their lives in their lane. And that has created the forum and the space to have the kinds of conversations that I have had and I witness being had here every minute of the day. You step outside of this space and you find people debating, discussing, and fomenting new ideas and new ways to approach their subjects because they have heard others who have different ideas and they aren't in an echo chamber. And that, to my mind, is the extraordinary power of the ORC. We create a debate which does not happen elsewhere, and that has advanced both the quality of the specific scientific programs that are supported and enabled and presented here, but also, very, very importantly, has driven the real advancements of science, with that now beginning to be manifest, as we saw in many of the presentations, in the real world. How you manage, how you use the science that is coming out of the world of your research to change and make the world a better place, whether it is inter-community, whether it is even on a bigger forum than that. And it's been an extraordinary story. I've got to say, though, there have been moments here in the last 3 days where I've been rather shocked, scared, and disappointed, because so many of the global indicators that we track here are trending in the wrong direction. And that is something that really is a call to arms for all of us. It's a call to arms and a call to urgency, which in many of our scientific endeavors we don't necessarily feel quite as pressingly. And to hear that, regardless of which subject was being discussed, where the indicators are pointed in the wrong direction, is, to my mind, something that we really do need to focus on and we need to drive. And what we've heard today and what we've heard prior here is also some of the solutions. And that's the beauty of it. Yes, the issues have been highlighted and we have had this scary wake-up call. It's not the first time, but it was again the scary wake-up call. But what we've also heard is there are real solutions that are being developed, that are available and can be implemented. And to my mind, that is the true power of this forum. And so it's really an amazing story of bringing multidisciplinary science to a single space where we can collaborate and cooperate to create a better, cohesive, inclusive answer. And the last presentation on the integration of people and wildlife, or people and the ecology, is symptomatic of the kind of win-win solutions that we need to find. And, you know, we covered such a range of topics: biodiversity loss, human-wildlife interfaces, land management and restoration, climate change, agroecology, sustainable use of natural resources and human ecosystems. I mean, you can't imagine a broader range of conversations. And that, to my mind, is again the power of this conference. So ultimately, we need to go away and turn what is, in its own way, its own echo chamber into a voice that can be carried to the rest of the world. And so the challenge from here on out for 25 and 26, before the ORC of 2026, is how do we take what we learned here in these last 3 days, popularize it, and make it really, really part of the mainstream that impacts the world and changes the way we live our lives. I really think that that is the mission for our future, and I hope you'll all join me in endeavoring to do that. And then finally, it's my responsibility to have some thank yous. And I'm never quite sure whether we should start with the most important, or maybe not the most important, but the most vital. But in this year, I've chosen to start with you, the delegates. Without you, this would not be possible. Without you, we wouldn't have the science. Without you, we wouldn't have the solutions. And it's for us collectively to take this to our future and make sure that this becomes part of the mainstream narrative of the world. Thank you so much for participating. The government participants that we've had, from ministers through professionals in different departments, are a vital part of carrying that message to the necessary constituents and to form the rules and regulations by which we live. And that too needs to be carried forward. And then ultimately to the team who have delivered this. First and foremost, the Oppenheimer generation, or not foremost, first, the Oppenheimer Generations team, who have created this extraordinary venue, have delivered this extraordinary product. And for the curation of the agenda, the formation of the processes that we've had, I think we need to pay very, very special attention to Duncan, his team of Rendani and Pumla, and the rest of the Oppenheimer Generations team. And then finally, and most importantly, I think we need to pay a real and meaningful tribute to the people who've made this possible, to the people who believe in a holistic approach, and leading that charge, and leading it from the time that I can remember 5, my mother. Mom? Wow, didn't expect that. She's an iconoclast. She is a true visionary, and she has been championing this space longer than anyone else in this room. And for that, I can only say thank you. And then to my father, who's made this all possible, thank you.
Sorry, good people, just one last thing before we go off. Sorry? Slightly. I did talk about a lottery, and the Gaming Commission has decided that Sindiswa Zondo is the winner. So if they could see Rendani Ngunda to collect their prize. And last of all the prize winners, if you could come to the front for your group photos, please. Thank you. It's the last you'll hear of me.